Let's talk about using thick roving style yarns, single ply, on the knitting machine. What you're looking at is some examples of patterns where I have done that, and it does in fact work, even though these were, of course, designed with hand knitting in mind. The yarns that I've used are being interspersed with the patterns that I used them on. The Peruvian poncho is one of my favorites. There are some challenges to using these yarns, whether hand knitting or machine knitting, but particularly in machine knitting, because they are very lightly spun. They can be a little bit fragile, but they are also just delightful to wear. They tend to loft a great deal after knitting and hand washing, and they are so cozy and comfy. So I think it's worth the effort to learn to machine knit them. Generally, they will knit on any bulky machine as long as you can use every other needle, even though they are number 5 yarns. That's what I did throughout the Bigger Than Bulky book. Not all of these patterns were created with single ply roving style yarn, but quite a few of them were, and they all involve either number 5 yarn or 2 strands of yarn that add up to number 5. But if you choose extra soft bulky yarns, you can knit them on every needle, as I did here with the Peruvian poncho in the Ponchos with Panache book. It had to be every needle for the Fair Isle to work right, so careful yarn selection makes that possible. So let's look at some tips and tricks that make knitting with such yarns possible on the knitting machine. First of all, always rewind the balls. The commercially wound balls may tangle when you machine knit. Even at the largest stitch size on a bulky machine, this is going to be a firm fabric. It doesn't really have much in the way of drape. And its firmness is such that when this fiber inevitably lofts, as you can see, it wants to do as soon as it gets worked, it will be pretty close to windproof. Do not expect a soft drape like for a shawl. That's not really its appropriate use. It's going to be textured more the way we would want a jacket to be textured. That's if we knit on every needle, as I'm going to be demonstrating. On every other needle, you can get a lovely soft drape. Here's an example of how this number 5 yarn can be draped softly. This is actually a loom knitting pattern, but with the right yarn on every other needle, you can get a drape this soft on a bulky knitting machine, and I am working on a machine knitted version of this garment. One important thing is to always weight the work when using a bulky, loosely spun yarn. Even if you don't normally find that you need to on your machine, it will be a great benefit here. With yarn this bulky, you want to save bulk every single time you can. So I've left this long yarn tail so it can be used to knit one side seam. Sew one side seam, saving one tail from weaving in. The tensioning device was not really built to handle a yarn this thick, and it may hold the yarn back too far to allow for nice stitching. If that's happening to you, do what I've done here. Skip it. Go over the bar, but under the tension spring, and then thread the rest of the yarn mass normally. But if you do that, slack may form in the yarn at the end of the row, and it will be your job to take it out. If you've ever worked on a bond machine, you'll recognize this activity. It won't be quite as much your job as it is on a bond because we are using the tension wire loop still. You will need to frequently pull down on the work because the thick fuzzy yarn doesn't always completely form itself a stitch and then drop down. So adjust the weights often and be prepared to check and manually pull down, as well as manually tightening up the excess yarn at the end of every row. Here's a good look at one of the reasons that we always rewind. See how twisty the yarn is? That's from being a single ply. It's only spun one direction. And while it's not spun very tightly, that can cause it to double back on itself and snag if we don't carefully rewind it. Ideally, you will always change skeins, and you'll have to do that pretty often, at the end of a row. But if you are concerned about the yarn supply being just barely enough, it is possible to do what you see me doing and change in the middle of a row. Drop the end of the yarn with still a few inches left, thread the new end, and then I do knot them together loosely. This can be undone and redone later, but I want those stitches to maintain their normal size while I complete the knitting. This yarn is too bulky to count on success if we allow them to elongate. You'll notice that I'm using quite a bit of weight. These weighted combs usually are from hobby machines, and I'm fortunate to have several. If you don't have that, you can make an ugly but extremely effective one following my instructions in Cheap Tricks and Cool Tools. If you don't have an assortment of these, you're still going to want a bunch of weight. So I would suggest your river comb in waste yarn with weights. Claw weights aren't really enough. This is Knob Hill yarn. Hirschner sometimes sells it at a really good deal. And although it is a number 6 yarn, which is usually designating super bulky, it's at the lower end of that, and it is very soft. It is indeed bulky, but also really squishy. Also, it's a really loosely spun single. I really love yarns like that. I like the way they feel. I like the way they fluff up inside the stitches. I just like them. But they do have a tendency to curl back on themselves like this. So you do have to knit them with some care. I always rewind these because when pulling them out from the center, they really tend to twist back on themselves. I do realize that virtuous knitters always rewind everything. I find sometimes I'm not that virtuous. I can get by with pulling from a center pull skein pretty often. This is not an example of a time I would try that. I have tried and I've been disappointed. This one has 80% wool, so it feels very, very woolly, but 20% acrylic. And I think that does give it a little bit of extra strength, which is nice for running it through the knitting machine because that puts it under more stress than either hand or loom knitting. And I like this for both as well. I've read the reviews on Hirschner's, and some people say it was very rough, like rug yarn. It doesn't seem it to me. Opinions vary. I like it. Personally, I like it knitted more loosely than this. This vest is for my husband who wants it to be windproof, and I'm designing it with that in mind. This is at the top end of what the machine will handle. So anytime you add anything extra challenging, such as there are 2 stitches on one needle because you've done a decrease, bring the working needles all the way forward, set the carriage to knit back from hold, and do that. Because by doing this yourself, you've done half the work. You have pushed the needles through the stitches, and the carriage need only catch them and draw them back with the yarn. It does make quite a difference in tough spots. It almost goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. We almost always want to use the maximum stitch size, 10 on this model, with bulky roving yarns. All of the yarns that were pictured at the beginning of the movie and are scrolling through again now are yarns that I have actually used successfully on the bulky knitting machine. So I'm hoping that will help you with your shopping and that you will be brave and learn to have as good a time as I have machine knitting bulky roving style yarn.